I'm Claire, 40, living alone in a small house just outside of Pittsburgh. My life used to feel like a well-worn sweater, familiar, comfortable, and a little threadbare in places. I teach at the neighborhood elementary school, and most days are predictable in the quiet way that suits me. After the divorce, predictability became a lifeline, something to hang on to when everything else felt unsteady. I like my routines: a slow cup of coffee before sunrise, lesson plans spread across the kitchen table, and evenings spent reading until the streetlights in my neighborhood blink off. People think I'm composed, maybe even unruffled by life's smaller storms, but over the last year I've felt small fractures forming beneath the surface. I don't talk about them much. My son, Eric, is my bright, loud counterpoint. He's the sort of person who fills a room without asking permission, bubbly, eager, and always on the lookout for the next joke to tell. He and I have always been close in the easy way that family is: familiar routines, shared histories, the shorthand of long conversations. He lives a few blocks from me, in the same suburban patch of town he grew up in, and sometimes I think his energy keeps me from folding to inward. His house always smells like someone who cooks often and forgets to empty the dish rack, a comforting, homey aroma that makes me relax when I step in the door. For the first few months after the divorce, I moved through my days with a private, steady ache lodged under my ribs. People were kind. They asked how I was, and I offered the safe, practiced response: I'm fine. But the truth slipped through in quieter moments: when I stood in front of the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back, when I sat at my kitchen table and felt the house echo with absence. I smiled at work, helped the kids tie their shoes, read them stories with the inflection that made each character live. And still, when the bell over the classroom door finally rang and the desks emptied, an old loneliness would settle in like rain. One evening, after a particularly long day of managing parent emails and a classroom that had more ants in the pants than usual, I found myself wandering into a convenience store in the next borough over, thinking maybe a bottle of wine and a new loaf of bread would be small comforts. It was a quiet place, one of those spots that seemed to stay open to feed late shift workers and insomniacs. Behind the counter was a young man whose face I'd seen before: tall, reserved, eyes always a little wary. He was always polite, helpful, with a slight, guarded smile. I learned his name that night: Lucas, the boy who logged late hours and looked like someone who preferred the company of books to crowded bars. I hadn't expected to need more than a basket and a few items, but somehow talking to the clerk felt like the simplest human exchange I could manage: a small acknowledgement that I existed. Evening, I said as I stepped inside, the bell over the door chiming softly. The fluorescent lights hummed and the aisles smelled faintly of coffee and dust. I had my hair loosely gathered and wore jeans, something comfortable and unremarkable. Lucas looked up and returned a gentle nod. "Hi," I said, letting my voice be soft. He answered in kind, and in the way strangers sometimes do. We traded a few quick sentences about the weather and a polite observation about the slow evening crowd. I reached for a bottle of wine, bread, and a few vegetables. He rang the items up without fuss, offering the casual professionalism of someone who has seen the late-night parade of weary customers. As he scanned my items, something came out of me I didn't expect. "Your son talks about you often," he said, flipping the receipt printer. I blinked, a little taken aback. Lucas had never met Eric. It was a small mistake. Then he shook his head and smiled apologetically. "Sorry, wrong person. I get names mixed up sometimes. My mind's been a little scattered tonight." I laughed gently, not wanting to make him uncomfortable. "It's fine," I said, feeling the ease of ordinary conversation wrap around me. He handed me the receipt and said, "Take care." I walked out with my purchases and settled into the familiar rhythm of my walk home. A few weeks after that mundane outside exchange, the evenings became clouded with a deeper weariness. My ex-husband had moved out months ago, and the house felt like an echo of a life I had helped build and now watched from the outside. I tried to be brave, to show up at school and be the teacher my students needed, but certain nights the solitude pressed close and my chest felt as if it might crack from the weight of it. I found myself doing small, deliberate things to distract the ache: pruning the rose bush until my fingers bled a little, volunteering for the PTA bake sale, watching old movies with the volume low enough to feel companionable, not intrusive. And sometimes, when the town seemed to be holding its breath, I would stop at Lucas's store for essentials and something more: an unremarkable human connection that chipped away at my loneliness. One rainy Wednesday, I left school late after overseeing a wet playground dismissal. The sky was the color of pewter, and I could feel a storm gathering in the way a breath catches before a scream. I ran a hand through my hair and climbed into my sedan, the car that had seen better days. Halfway down the county road, the engine began to cough and stumble. At first, I thought it was the rain getting into the intake, but the sputter became constant. I coasted onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The lights blinked as if it were a living thing giving up. I sat there for a long minute, listening to the thunder roll and feeling the night close around me. My phone showed a single bar of service, and for a second the world seemed to tilt. I tried to remember how to fix cars, not that I ever had much success with them. Panic created a tightness behind my sternum. I took a breath, the kind that steadies you at the lip of a cliff, and then I did something that surprised me. I called Lucas. It felt like the most sensible option. He worked nights, and I had seen him at the store more often than not. It was a small human bridge in a wild, uncertain place. After only a couple of rings, his voice came through, calm, youthful, with a crack of hesitation. "Hello?" he asked. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Lucas, it's Claire. I'm sorry to bother you, but my car, it stopped on Holloway Road. I'm a little outside of town," and my voice faltered. The rain pelted harder against the window, making a percussion that matched the quickening of my pulse. He didn't hesitate. "Stay put," he said, the kind of clear, practical instruction people use when they want to be useful. "Lock your doors. I'll come right away." Relief flooded me in a hot rush that was almost embarrassing. "Thank you," I whispered. "Please hurry." He told me he was on his way, and I believed him. I held on to the faith that someone would arrive. I turned the car's interior light off to conserve battery and watched the windshield rhythmically receive the rain. When Lucas pulled up, it felt like a private oratorio, gravel crunching, headlights cutting through the downpour, the silhouette of a man who had crossed the river from his own solitude to help a stranger. I opened the door to the smell of wet asphalt and the clean flash of a flashlight. He got out and moved with a purpose that calmed me even further. "Are you okay?" he asked, and I realized my knees were weak. I said, "I think so. I'm scared though." There it was, the admission that made me feel both vulnerable and strangely honest. There was another figure near my car when his headlights settled on the shoulder, a man leaning too close, someone who looked like the sort who belonged in a different kind of night. He had a sway in his posture that made my skin bristle, and his words were too soft, too pushy for the privacy of the roadside. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said in a drawl, sliding a hand closer to me as if proximity alone could be mistaken for warmth. The world around me shrank, and my instinct told me this situation could go badly if I didn't act. I felt ridiculous and thankful all at once when Lucas stepped forward, his voice firm and unexpectedly steady. "Hey, step away from her," he said, the authoritative tone surprising for such a reserved young man. The stranger looked up at him and for a moment turned his baleful attention from me to the newcomer. "Mind your own business," the man grunted, his words slurred from drink or bravado. "This woman's fine." He took another step toward us, and something in his posture made my heart race faster. I felt exposed, but not alone, and that difference was everything. Lucas didn't back down. He stood between us like a small, stubborn sentinel, the rain drawing lines down his jacket. "She asked you to leave," he said firmly. "Now go." His voice had a quiet edge I hadn't quite heard before, like someone who had practiced the sound in his head and finally found the nerve to use it. The stranger swore under his breath, took a stumbling step away, and then turned and lurched toward his truck, muttering as he went. It was foolish to think the danger had evaporated completely, but as the stranger's taillights dissolved into the rainy night, the immediate threat receded. I remember the sweet ridiculousness of relief that came over me, then the way my shoulders unclenched and tears stung the back of my throat. I felt shaky, flushed, and suddenly very aware of the human warmth in my chest that comes from realizing you were looked after without question. "Thank you," I said, my voice small. He stepped close and placed a hand on my shoulder, gentle, respectful. "You're safe now. I'm here." The simple reassurance settled over me like a soft blanket. We stood there for a long breath, the rain washing the highway shoulder in a glossy sheen. He popped the hood and fumbled through the engine with a flashlight, his hands turning over things I barely recognized. It was obvious to me, if not to him, that the problem ran deeper than a loose belt or a drained battery. The car shell had the kind of silence that tells you it won't go anywhere without a professional. He closed the hood finally, his face faintly grim. "It's not moving tonight," he said. I nodded, already resigned to that truth, and the thought of being towed home in the morning felt like an idol of patience. "Let me take you home," he offered, and I realized how generous that sounded, how comforting it would be to sit in a warm vehicle with someone I could trust. For a beat, I hesitated. Even though I knew him only as the steady-eyed clerk behind a counter, 1,000 small social cautions rose up in me: boundaries, logic, what people would say. Then, because my limbs were weak from the rain and fear, and because I wanted to be somewhere safe, I accepted. He helped me into his truck, and the leather smelled faintly of pine and the musk of a person who carried the night on him. We started back along the country lanes toward my house, the road slick and anonymous, lit only by the occasional yellow halo of a streetlight. At first we drove in companionable silence, listening to the rain on the roof. It felt intimate without being forced. Two people who had been strangers and suddenly were tethered by shared adrenaline. After a while, the quiet pooled around us and I found my voice. "I'm sorry for calling you," I said. "I know it wasn't your job." My hands tightened on the seatbelt. He glanced over with that guarded look of his, and I saw the freckle-sprinkled line above his eyebrow that I had noticed months ago at the counter. "It was no trouble," he said quietly. "I was glad you called." His words were simple and steady, and something inside me slackened a little. I could feel the irony of the moment: an older woman being helped home by a young night worker, and yet there was nothing petty or performative about it. He was genuinely kind. The hills around my house were slick with a soft rain that made the trees gleam. When we finally turned onto my driveway and parked, I felt the residue of the night lift from my shoulders in small, fluttering bursts. My house looked quieter than normal, the porch light a small beacon cutting the dark. I turned off the engine and took a breath, reluctant to leave the safety of his company. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" I asked, surprising myself with the straightforwardness of it. Maybe it was the vulnerability of the night, or maybe something else: an acknowledgement that the world had shifted for both of us and this was a fragile chance to talk. He looked at me, and I saw a complicated mix of hesitance and gratitude cross his face. "I should probably head back," he said at first, but there was a softness in his tone that made my heart squeeze. "It's late, Claire." He'd learned my name in pieces over the previous weeks. I could tell I'd affected him, and the thought that he might be uncomfortable brought on a reflexive protectiveness I didn't fully understand. "I won't be long," I insisted, and he agreed after a beat, perhaps because something unspoken tightened between us that neither of us wanted to resist. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and paperbacks. I poured tea and we sat at my small kitchen table, the rain's rhythm outside translating into a domestic, almost sacred ambience. It felt like an intimacy that had to be handled with care, the kind that forms when two people see each other's edges and choose not to look away. As we warmed our hands on our cups, I found myself telling him things I didn't expect to say, about the divorce, about how the house sometimes felt like a museum of our former family life. The words came out soft, and yet they surprised me with their honesty. He listened without interruption, his eyes steady and attentive in that way that makes you feel both seen and safe. "I feel invisible sometimes," I admitted, fingers warming around the porcelain. "Like moving furniture around in a room and still not knowing where I belong." My confession was small, but it bore weight. He looked surprised, then sympathetic. "I don't think you're invisible," Lucas said, and I felt the warmth of the phrase in a surprising place. "You're real. That matters." We talked about small things: the kids he liked from his neighborhood, the odd jobs he had done to get by, and then less small things, like my plans for the garden and his hopes for a quiet repair shop of his own. I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. There was something tender about being allowed to be seen without curtains, to speak of sadness without it being a performance. When the rain eased and the sky began to clear, he stood up, gathering his coat. I walked him to the door and felt a softness in my chest I couldn't name. "Thanks," I said, the kind of gratitude that stretched beyond the moment. "For tonight, for not letting me feel alone," he said, with a small, shy smile. "Anytime, Claire. You deserve to feel safe." We stood for a heartbeat more, then he left into the damp air. In the days that followed, I found it impossible to stop thinking about that night. The image of him standing in his jacket on my driveway, the sound of his voice when he told me to lock the doors, those things hovered around me like moths around a porch light. He began to appear in my life more often, not because I sought him out so much as because our lives started to orbit each other. He'd pop into the grocery store I favored, or I'd see him taking the long route home on foot. Sometimes I'd make excuses to be at places he might be. It surprised me how quickly my heart would do small stunts when I caught sight of him across a small room. One quiet night, I found myself lingering in the convenience store after a staff meeting, and there he was, Lucas, leaning against the counter, his expression open in a way that made me feel seen. The store was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. I found a chair near the front and sat down, our conversation picking up where it had left off. "I wanted to thank you again," I said simply, because gratitude had become a language I had to speak out loud. "You didn't have to come for me that night." He looked at me, and for the first time I noticed how much more I was taking in now. The little scar by his eyebrow, the way his hands moved when he explained something, the careful cadence of his speech. "It wasn't a big deal," he answered, but the sincerity in his eyes told me he meant it. "I like helping." It felt like the right thing to do. There was a steadiness about his words that made me feel safe, and it surprised me how much that steadiness resonated. "You're different," I said, before I could swallow the thought. "In a good way." Quiet but steady. He seemed pleased and a little embarrassed at the same time, and in that moment something shifted in the air between us, like the first tentative steps toward a bridge. In the weeks that followed, our dialogues deepened, drifting from pleasantries into trust. I would invite him for tea under the pretense of a storm, and he would accept, lingering over the warmth and conversation as if it were a balm. I found myself sharing little fragments of my life I hadn't thought to voice, stories of students who had surprised me, memories of better times with my ex, the quiet guilt that sometimes threaded its way into my relief. He, in turn, spoke of his hopes and his quiet confidence in small, practical ways, a plan to one day open a modest repair shop, an honest longing for a life where the night shift wasn't the bulk of his existence. Eventually, the broken car was mended. He had worked on it during his off hours, coaxing its stubborn parts back into motion with the patience of someone who respected the mechanical and the fragile alike. When I saw the car run smoothly again, I felt a small domestic happiness that surprised me with its intensity. One evening, after he told me it was ready, I invited him to bring it by so I could see the work. The sky had been threatening to storm all day, and as I turned the corner into my driveway, the clouds gathered in a way that felt almost cinematic. I noticed the faint rumble of thunder in the distance as he pulled up and parked in my driveway, the car I'd once worried would never move again now purring with a renewed life. I opened the door to let him in, and he stepped inside with the easy manners that made me feel like I'd chosen the correct space for him: my kitchen, my couch. The rain arrived moments later, spilling down in sudden sheets like someone had tipped a bucket over the sky. "You won't be going anywhere for a bit," I said, a smile curving under my words. Stay until it calms." He chuckled and accepted the invitation, settling into a chair opposite mine while the house filled with the scent of damp earth and tea. That evening, conversation moved from small talk to a deeper honesty. I told him about nights when I stood at my window thinking of who I'd been and who I might become. He listened with a kind of focus that made me feel important in the most painless way. "Sometimes I don't recognize myself," I confessed. "I look in the mirror and see someone I don't know." The words landed between us, and his reaction surprised me. He reached across the table and placed his hand near mine, not touching, but close enough that the warmth was felt. "You aren't invisible," he said, quietly and without flourish. "Not to me. You're someone who matters." The earnestness of his statement made my throat tighten. "Do you mean that?" I asked, because part of me had grown so used to illusions of invisibility that the truth sounded implausible. He nodded, meeting my gaze. "I do. I've noticed you for a while." His words felt like the slow sinking of a stone showing up after ripples stopped. We talked late into the night, and for the first time in months I felt like the shape of something possible was forming, something unconstrained by my fears. It wasn't a loud revelation, but a quiet opening, like a door left slightly ajar on a room where sunlight touched the floor. When the storm subsided and he prepared to leave, there was a mutual hesitance neither of us wanted to break. At the door he said, with more candor than his usual reserve allowed, "You deserve someone who makes you feel seen, Claire." My heart gave a small lurch. "Maybe," I said, with a half smile, "maybe that person is already in my kitchen." The next days were complicated by the truths I couldn't ignore. I had a son, and family routines to consider. There was also the subtle social weight of the age difference. He was younger, quieter, a night worker with an honest ambition. But these practical concerns did not erase the burgeoning tenderness. Instead, they made it feel more complicated and more real. I began to notice how often I thought of his presence at odd hours, his mannerisms, the quiet way he listened. Yet along with these growing feelings came a deep swell of fear. What if this could fracture something precious? Eric and I were close. His opinion mattered more than I would readily admit. The thought of hurting him for something so fraught felt like a betrayal. I found myself pulling back, making excuses, not answering the phone as quickly when he texted. The shame of it gnawed at me. I told myself I was protecting what mattered by stepping away from something that felt dangerous. But the truth is, distance felt like a hollow solace. I tried to bury the feelings in busier days, more after school clubs, longer meetings, but they bent around my attempts like sunlight finding a crack. Lucas noticed, of course. The few times I appeared at the store, he softened, a quietly obvious confusion about my sudden coolness. The most painful part was that I didn't have the courage to tell him why. Each time I resisted the urge to reach out, it felt as if my chest constricted just a little more. Then one late night, worn down by the weight of the unsaid, I found myself walking into the store while he was on shift. "Lucas," I said, and the bell chimed our reconciliation. He looked up and the sight of him took my breath away. "Claire," he answered, his voice light and guarded. For a moment I hesitated near the doorway, feeling small and suddenly childlike in the face of my own emotions. "Can we talk?" I asked, and the simple request felt like stepping off a cliff. He turned the sign in the door, setting the store to closed, and we remained in the artificial quiet of fluorescent bulbs and paperbacks. The space between us thrummed with things not yet said. "You've been avoiding me," he started, not accusatory but honest. "I can tell." The bluntness of it made me look at him, and my breath hitched. "I'm sorry," I said, and for the first time I allowed the truth to come through my lips. I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought stepping back would make things easier. He took a step closer, his expression searching. "For whom?" he asked quietly. "Because it certainly hasn't been easier for me." His vulnerability steeled something raw and hopeful within me. I looked at him, the confession heavy on my tongue and waiting to be released. "It's because of how I feel about you," I said, the admission shaking from me in a whisper. "I've been trying to hide it so I wouldn't wreck everything: my family, your life, the good parts we both have. But I can't keep pretending this isn't real." His eyes widened and then softened in a way that made my heart stumble. "You're not the only one," he said with a slow, careful honesty that made the air buzz. I felt something too. From that first night on the road, I noticed you. It was unexpected, but it's been here. The relief that washed through me was nearly physical, like arriving at shore after a long swim. We were there together, at the edge of something that was both tender and terrifying. We talked for a long time after that, not racing toward conclusions but allowing ourselves to be curious. "What about Eric?" he asked eventually, pragmatic and also wary. He had an earnestness in him I hadn't realized was so calming. I thought about my son, about the life we had woven together, and about the ripple effects any change might cause. "I know it's complicated," I admitted, "but ignoring what's between us doesn't seem fair either." We both nodded, understanding that there was no clean, painless path forward. There would be conversations and hesitations, and we had to be willing to navigate those with patience. We agreed to move slowly, a word that felt like both permission and a promise. We did not rush into declarations or make grand plans. Instead, we chose to test and learn, to spend time together when it felt natural, to keep honesty at the forefront, and to treat the delicate situation with respect for everyone involved. That night, as we stood beneath the dim streetlight outside the store, I felt lighter than I had in months. The ache of secrecy eased. We walked to my car together in easy silence, our steps in tune. At my driveway, he paused and looked at me in a way that was both gentle and steady. "We don't have to answer anyone tonight," he said softly. "We'll just be honest with each other." Those words felt like an anchor. I smiled because the thought of starting from a place of truth felt less terrifying than I'd expected. He walked me to the door, staying just long enough to be reassuring, then left with an understated kindness that made me feel cherished and protected. As I watched him disappear down the walk, a warmth spread through me. The future was uncertain, and that made my heart race with both fear and excitement. There were logistical concerns, emotional hurdles, and external judgments to consider, but the most important thing was the quiet decision we made between us, to be honest, to be careful, and to let whatever could grow do so slowly and with mutual respect. Over the following weeks, that patient tenderness became the scaffolding for something neither of us had planned. We met for tea, fixed small things around my house together, shared long conversations that felt like tending a fragile plant. We navigated family dinners and small social ripples with care. I introduced him to Eric gently, and while the meeting was awkward at first, it grew into a respectful warmth over time. We spoke candidly with each other more and more often, negotiating boundaries, expectations, and the practicalities of dating in a life where both of us had history and obligations. What I learned through it all was that compassion can take many forms, and courage isn't just dramatic heroism. It's the steady presence that makes another person feel seen. The night Lucas came to help me on that rain-swept road was a simple gesture, but it became the fulcrum that shifted the trajectory of my life. Standing between me and a stranger who meant harm, Lucas had been an unexpected guardian, and later, an unexpected companion. He taught me that it was possible to be both protected and cherished at once. More than anything, our connection reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten, that I deserved to be cared for, to be noticed, and to be loved in a way that honored my whole self. The slow unfolding of our relationship showed me how two people could choose honesty and tenderness in the face of complexity. It gave me a new sense of courage, the kind that comes from being willing to open a door and let someone in, even when the weather outside is still stormy. If you've ever had a small kindness reframe your life, you know how quietly powerful that can be. A single act, someone showing up in a moment of need, can ripple outward, changing how you see yourself and the world. I invite you to share those moments, the ones where someone's care made a difference, and to consider how showing up for someone else might be the single thing that reshapes their horizon. For me, the story didn't end with a dramatic revelation. It unfolded in patient conversations, gentle reassurances, and the steady willingness to walk home together when the night felt too dark to face alone.